If this story moves you, drop a heart in the comments. In the remote wilderness of the Kalahari Desert, where the endless expanse of golden sand meets the azure sky, an extraordinary tale was about to unfold that would challenge everything we thought we knew about the natural world. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a wildlife biologist with over 15 years of experience studying predator behavior, had established a small research station near the edge of a vast conservation area. Her weathered hands and sun-kissed face told the story of countless hours spent observing the intricate dance of life in one of Africa's most unforgiving environments. The morning sun cast long shadows across the research camp when Sarah received an urgent radio call from Marcus, a local wildlife ranger whose deep knowledge of the desert had proven invaluable over the years. His voice crackled through the static, carrying an urgency that immediately caught her attention. A female lioness had been found dead near the eastern boundary of the reserve, and beside her lifeless body lay two tiny cubs, no more than a few weeks old, their eyes barely open and their small bodies trembling with cold and hunger. Sarah's heart sank as she listened to the details. Orphan lion cubs had virtually no chance of survival in the wild without their mother's protection and nourishment. The harsh reality of nature meant that these vulnerable babies would likely become prey to hyenas, leopards, or other predators within hours. She grabbed her emergency kit and raced across the dusty terrain in her battered Land Rover, the vehicle bouncing over rocks and through shallow ravines as she navigated the familiar yet treacherous landscape. When she arrived at the scene, the sight that greeted her was both heartbreaking and puzzling. The lioness lay motionless beneath a scattered acacia tree, her golden coat dulled by death. But it was what she observed in the branches above that stopped her in her tracks. Perched on a sturdy branch, its massive wings partially spread in a protective gesture, was a magnificent African fish eagle. The bird's distinctive white head and tail feathers gleamed in the morning light, and its piercing yellow eyes seemed to be watching over something with unusual intensity. Below the eagle, huddled together in a small depression between the tree roots, were the two lion cubs. They were pitifully small, their tawny fur still bearing the spotted pattern of very young lions. Their tiny mews of distress echoed across the silent landscape, but what struck Sarah as truly remarkable was the eagle's behavior. Instead of viewing the cubs as potential prey or simply ignoring them, the great bird appeared to be standing guard, occasionally calling out with its distinctive cry whenever other scavengers approached. Marcus arrived shortly after Sarah, his experienced eyes taking in the unusual scene with a mixture of wonder and skepticism. He had spent decades in the bush and had witnessed many extraordinary animal behaviors, but this was unlike anything in his vast repertoire of wildlife encounters. The eagle, which they would later name Sentinel due to its watchful nature, showed no signs of aggression toward the cubs. Instead, it seemed to have appointed itself as their protector. Sarah carefully approached the cubs, her movements slow and deliberate to avoid startling the eagle. To her amazement, Sentinel remained calm, watching her with what could only be described as intelligent assessment. The cubs, whom she decided to call Kasai and Django, were severely dehydrated and weak from hunger. Their small bodies were barely warm to the touch, and their breathing was shallow and rapid. Time was running out for these tiny lives. Working quickly but gently, Sarah wrapped the cubs in soft blankets and prepared to transport them back to her research station. As she lifted them, Sentinel let out a series of calls that seemed almost conversational, as if the eagle was communicating its approval of her actions. The bird's behavior was so unusual that Sarah found herself speaking to it, explaining in soft tones that she would take good care of the cubs. The journey back to the research station was filled with uncertainty. Lion cubs required specialized care, and without their mother's milk, their chances of survival remained slim. Sarah had successfully hand-raised various wildlife species over the years, but lions presented unique challenges. They needed frequent feeding, constant warmth, and most importantly, they needed to learn the complex social behaviors that would allow them to eventually return to the wild. As they arrived at the research station, Sarah was surprised to see a large shadow pass overhead. Sentinel had followed them, soaring gracefully above the vehicle with powerful wing beats that carried the magnificent bird effortlessly through the desert air. The eagle circled the compound several times before settling on a tall radio antenna, its keen eye surveying the new environment with obvious interest. Sarah set up a makeshift nursery in one of the research station's climate-controlled rooms. She prepared specialized milk formula designed for big cat cubs, warming it to the perfect temperature before carefully feeding Kasai and Django through small bottles. The cubs were so weak that feeding was a delicate process, requiring patience and skill to ensure they didn't aspirate the formula. Their tiny paws kneaded weakly at the blankets as they nursed, a heartbreaking reminder of how they would have nursed from their mother. Throughout that first critical night, Sarah maintained a vigil over the cubs, checking their breathing, monitoring their body temperature, and feeding them every 2 hours. The work was exhausting, but she had committed herself to giving these orphan babies the best possible chance at life. What she didn't expect was to discover that she wasn't the only one keeping watch. As dawn broke over the research station, Sarah stepped outside to stretch her tired muscles and breathe the crisp morning air. There, perched on a nearby fence post, was Sentinel. The eagle had remained throughout the night, its powerful form silhouetted against the lightning sky. When the bird saw Sarah, it uttered a soft call, almost as if it was checking on the status of the cubs. This began what would become one of the most extraordinary interspecies relationships ever documented. Over the following days, Sentinel established a routine around the research station. The eagle would arrive each morning just as Sarah began her first feeding of the cubs, and it would remain nearby throughout the day, hunting for fish in a small water source behind the compound but always returning to its watchful position. As Kasai and Jingo grew stronger, their personalities began to emerge. Kasai, the female, was bold and curious, always the first to explore new toys or investigate unfamiliar sounds. Her amber eyes held an intelligence that seemed beyond her young age, and she showed a remarkable lack of fear that both impressed and concerned Sarah. Jingo, slightly smaller but equally spirited, was more cautious in his approach to new experiences, but once he committed to something, he pursued it with single-minded determination. The cubs' growth was remarkable. Within 2 weeks, they had doubled in size, their spotted coats becoming more pronounced and their movements more coordinated. They began to play with each other, engaging in the mock battles and stalking games that would prepare them for their future as apex predators. Sarah documented every milestone, from their first solid food to their initial attempts at roaring, which emerged as adorable squeaks that bore little resemblance to the powerful calls they would eventually master. But it was Sentinel's continued presence that truly set this situation apart from any other wildlife rehabilitation case Sarah had encountered. The eagle seemed to understand that the cubs were under Sarah's protection, and it began to exhibit behaviors that suggested a deep emotional investment in their welfare. When other predators approached the research station, Sentinel would take flight, circling overhead and calling out warnings that effectively deterred potential threats. One morning, about a month after the cubs' rescue, Sarah witnessed something that challenged her understanding of animal behavior. She was cleaning the cubs' enclosure when she heard Sentinel's distinctive call, but this time it carried a different tone, more urgent and insistent. Looking up, she saw the eagle hovering near the enclosure, its powerful wings beating steadily as it seemed to be trying to communicate something important. Following the eagle's gaze, Sarah noticed that Jingo had managed to squeeze through a gap in the fencing that she hadn't realized was large enough for a growing cub. The young lion was wandering toward the edge of the compound, approaching an area where Sarah knew leopards and hyenas sometimes hunted. Sentinel's warning had potentially prevented a tragedy, and Sarah quickly secured the wayward cub before reinforcing the enclosure. This incident marked a turning point in the relationship between Sentinel and the cubs. The eagle began to spend more time in direct proximity to their enclosure, often perching on posts nearby where it could observe their activities. Sarah noticed that the cubs, in turn, seemed to recognize the eagle as a benevolent presence. They would look up when Sentinel called, and they showed no fear when the large bird landed near their play area. As the weeks turned into months, the cubs continued to thrive under Sarah's dedicated care. They grew rapidly, their baby fat giving way to the lean muscle that would serve them well as adult hunters. Their play became more sophisticated, incorporating the stalking and pouncing techniques they would need to survive in the wild. Sarah began introducing them to whole prey items, teaching them to tear meat and develop the jaw strength they would require as adult lions. Sentinel's role in this unusual family dynamic became increasingly complex. The eagle began bringing small fish and occasionally rodents to the area near the cubs' enclosure, not as food for the growing lions, but seemingly as offerings or gifts. This behavior was unprecedented in Sarah's experience, and she began to document it carefully, recognizing that she might be witnessing something that had never been recorded before. The cubs' response to these gifts was equally fascinating. Rather than immediately consuming the offerings, they would often play with them first, batting at the fish or carrying the rodents around in their mouths like toys. It was as if they understood that these items came from their aerial guardian and deserved special attention. Sarah began to wonder if the cubs were learning behaviors from Sentinel that went beyond typical feline instincts. As Kasai and Jingo approached their 6th month of life, they had grown into magnificent young lions. Kasai had developed into a sleek, powerful female with intelligent eyes and a confident bearing that suggested she would become a formidable huntress. Django had grown larger and more muscular, his mane beginning to show the first hints of the impressive crown he would eventually wear. Both cubs had maintained their bond with each other while also developing individual relationships with both Sarah and Sentinel. The time was approaching when Sarah would need to make critical decisions about the cubs' future. They were becoming too large and powerful to remain in the research station indefinitely, and their natural instincts were beginning to assert themselves more strongly. She had been in contact with several wildlife reserves that might be able to accommodate the young lions, but the thought of separating them from Sentinel troubled her deeply. The eagle had become such an integral part of their lives that Sarah worried about the psychological impact of separation. She had observed behaviors in both the cubs and the eagle that suggested emotional bonds that went far beyond simple coexistence. Sentinel seemed to take pride in the cubs' achievements, calling out approvingly when they successfully completed challenging tasks or demonstrated new skills. The cubs, in turn, would often look to the sky for the eagle when they were uncertain or afraid, as if seeking reassurance from their unlikely guardian. One evening, as Sarah sat outside the cubs' enclosure watching them play in the fading light, she noticed Sentinel approaching with something unusual in its talons. Instead of the typical fish or small mammal, the eagle was carrying a long, straight stick. With careful precision, Sentinel dropped the stick near the cubs and then landed nearby, watching expectantly. Kasai was the first to investigate, approaching the stick with the cautious curiosity that had become her trademark. She sniffed it carefully, then began to bat at it with her paws. Django joined her, and soon both cubs were engaged in a complex game that involved carrying the stick, wrestling over it, and using it as a prop in their mock hunting scenarios. Sarah watched in amazement as she realized that Sentinel had essentially provided the cubs with an enrichment toy, demonstrating an understanding of their need for mental stimulation and play. This incident prompted Sarah to reconsider her assumptions about the relationship between Sentinel and the cubs. What she had initially viewed as an unusual but temporary guardianship was revealing itself to be something far more profound. The eagle wasn't simply protecting the cubs out of some misguided parental instinct. It was actively participating in their development and education. Over the following weeks, Sarah observed numerous instances of what could only be described as teaching behavior from Sentinel. The eagle would demonstrate hunting techniques, showing the cubs how to remain motionless while stalking prey, even though the hunting methods of eagles and lions were fundamentally different. Sentinel would also model alertness behaviors, teaching the cubs to scan their environment constantly for potential threats or opportunities. The cubs, remarkably, seemed to understand and appreciate these lessons. They would watch intently when Sentinel demonstrated a particular behavior, and they would often attempt to incorporate elements of what they had observed into their own play and practice sessions. Sarah began to document these interactions more systematically, recognizing that she was witnessing something that could revolutionize understanding of interspecies communication and learning. As the cubs approached their first birthday, they had grown into impressive young lions. Kasai weighed nearly 100 pounds and moved with the fluid grace of a natural predator. Her hunting instincts were sharp, and she had successfully caught several small animals that had wandered into the compound. Django had grown even larger, approaching 150 pounds, and his developing mane was beginning to give him the regal appearance of an adult male lion. The question of their future became increasingly urgent. Sarah knew that keeping them at the research station much longer would be neither safe nor fair to the cubs. They needed space to roam, opportunities to hunt, and eventually, the chance to establish their own territories and perhaps raise families of their own. But the thought of separating them from Sentinel continued to trouble her. The solution came from an unexpected source. Dr. James Whitmore, the director of a large wildlife preserve about 200 miles to the south, contacted Sarah with an intriguing proposal. His reserve was home to several eagle species, including African fish eagles, and he had heard about the unusual relationship between Sentinel and the cubs through the Wildlife Rehabilitation Network. He offered to provide a large, semi-wild enclosure where the cubs could be gradually introduced to independent living while potentially maintaining their relationship with Sentinel. The proposal was appealing, but it raised numerous logistical and ethical questions. Would Sentinel choose to follow the cubs to their new home? Could the eagle adapt to a new environment? Most importantly, would the separation from their current home cause psychological trauma to any of the three animals involved? Sarah spent weeks considering the options, consulting with other wildlife experts and animal behaviorists. The consensus was that the cubs needed to be given the opportunity to live as naturally as possible, even if it meant risking the disruption of their unique relationship with Sentinel. The decision was made to attempt the relocation, with careful monitoring and the option to reverse course if the animal showed signs of distress. The day of the move arrived with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Sarah had prepared specialized transport crates for Kasai and Django, designed to minimize stress during the long journey. The cubs, now weighing over 300 pounds combined, required careful handling and sedation to ensure their safety during transport. As the veterinary team prepared the cubs for the journey, Sentinel watched from its perch with obvious agitation, calling out frequently and pacing along its perch. The convoy of vehicles that would transport the cubs to their new home included Sarah's research vehicle, a specialized animal transport truck, and a support vehicle carrying additional supplies and equipment. As they prepared to depart, Sarah looked up to see Sentinel circling overhead, its powerful cries echoing across the compound. The eagle seemed to understand that something significant was happening. The journey to the wildlife preserve took most of the day, with regular stops to check on the cubs and ensure their comfort. Throughout the trip, Sarah found herself scanning the skies, hoping to catch a glimpse of Sentinel. She had no way of knowing if the eagle would attempt to follow them, or if it would simply return to its natural territory and resume its normal life. As they approached the wildlife preserve, Sarah was struck by the beauty and scope of the facility. Thousands of acres of natural habitat stretched as far as the eye could see, with rivers, forests, and grasslands that would provide an ideal environment for the cubs to develop their natural behaviors. Dr. Whitmore met them at the entrance, his enthusiasm for the project evident in his warm greeting and detailed explanations of the facilities they had prepared. The cubs' new enclosure was impressive in its size and complexity. Covering nearly 50 acres, it included varied terrain, natural water sources, and carefully placed hiding spots that would allow Kasai and Django to establish territories while still being monitored by the preserve staff. The enclosure was designed to be gradually expanded as the cubs adapted, eventually allowing them access to even larger areas of the preserve. The process of introducing the cubs to their new environment was carefully orchestrated. Sarah remained with them for the first several days, helping them adjust to the new sights, sounds, and smells. Kasai adapted quickly, exploring every corner of the enclosure with her characteristic boldness. Django was more cautious, staying close to familiar scents and gradually expanding his comfort zone. But it was the absence of Sentinel that seemed to affect both cubs most profoundly. They would often look to the sky, calling out with soft vocalizations that Sarah had never heard before. Their behavior suggested that they were searching for their aerial guardian, and Sarah's heart ached as she watched them struggle with the separation. On the third day after their arrival, Sarah was awakened by excited calls from the preserve staff. Racing outside, she looked up to see a familiar silhouette circling high above the cubs' enclosure. Sentinel had found them. The eagle had somehow tracked them across 200 miles of unfamiliar territory, demonstrating a level of determination and navigational ability that left everyone speechless. The reunion between Sentinel and the cubs was emotional and profound. As the eagle descended to perch on a tall tree within the enclosure, both Kasai and Django ran toward it, calling out with obvious joy and relief. Sentinel responded with its own vocalizations, and for several minutes, the three animals engaged in what could only be described as a conversation, with calls and responses that seemed to carry deep meaning. Dr. Whitmore and his staff were amazed by what they witnessed. The eagle's arrival had an immediate positive effect on the cubs' behavior. They became more active, more confident, and more willing to explore their new environment. It was as if Sentinel's presence provided them with the security they needed to embrace their new life. Over the following months, the unusual family settled into a new routine at the wildlife preserve. Sentinel established a territory that encompassed the cubs' enclosure and the surrounding area, hunting in the preserve's rivers and lakes while maintaining its watchful presence over Kasai and Django. The cubs continued to grow and develop, their hunting skills improving dramatically as they had access to natural prey within their expanded territory. The preserve staff documented numerous instances of continued interaction between Sentinel and the cubs. The eagle would often call out warnings when unfamiliar humans approached the enclosure, and it seemed to take particular interest in the cubs' hunting attempts, sometimes circling overhead when they were stalking prey as if offering encouragement or guidance. As Kasai and Django approached their second birthday, they had grown into magnificent adult lions. Kasai had developed into a powerful huntress, capable of taking down prey as large as small antelope. Her confidence and skill were evident in every movement, and she had begun to establish her own territory within the larger enclosure. Django had grown into an impressive male, his mane now full and luxurious, marking him as a mature lion ready to claim his place in the natural hierarchy. The question of their eventual release into the wild became a topic of intense discussion among the preserve staff and wildlife experts. Both lions had developed excellent hunting skills and natural behaviors, but their unusual upbringing raised questions about how they would interact with wild lion populations. Their bond with Sentinel also complicated any release plans, as separating them again seemed cruel and potentially harmful to all three animals. The solution came in the form of an expanded territory within the preserve. Dr. Whitmore proposed creating a semi-wild environment where Kasai and Django could live as naturally as possible while still being monitored and protected. This area would be large enough to support their natural behaviors while allowing them to maintain their relationship with Sentinel. The plan was implemented gradually, with the cubs' territory expanded in stages until they had access to nearly 1,000 acres of diverse habitat. This area included other wildlife species, creating a complex ecosystem where the lions could practice their natural behaviors while contributing to the preserve's conservation goals. Sentinel adapted to each expansion of territory, adjusting its own range to maintain its protective watch over the lions. The eagle's presence seemed to provide a sense of continuity and security that allowed Kasai and Django to embrace their new freedom while maintaining the emotional bonds that had sustained them since their earliest days. As the years passed, the unusual family continued to thrive. Kasai eventually mated with a male lion that was introduced to the preserve, and she gave birth to 2 healthy cubs of her own. Remarkably, Sentinel seemed to extend its protective instincts to these new additions, watching over the growing family with the same dedication it had shown to Kasai and Django. Django established himself as a dominant male within the preserve, his impressive size and confident bearing earning him respect from both the preserve staff and the other animals. He remained close to his sister and her cubs, demonstrating the strong family bonds that had been fostered during his unusual upbringing. The relationship between Sentinel and the lion family became the subject of scientific study, with researchers from around the world visiting the preserve to observe and document their interactions. The case challenged traditional understanding of interspecies relationships and provided new insights into animal intelligence, emotion, and social behavior. Sarah continued to visit the preserve regularly, documenting the ongoing development of this remarkable family. She watched with pride and wonder as Kasai's cubs grew under the watchful eye of their grandmother figure, Sentinel. The eagle, now showing signs of advanced age, remained devoted to its adopted family, its presence a constant reminder of the extraordinary bonds that could form between different species. The story of Sentinel, Kasai, and Django became legendary within the wildlife conservation community, inspiring new approaches to animal rehabilitation and challenging assumptions about the emotional lives of wild animals. Their bond demonstrated that love, protection, and family could transcend species boundaries, creating relationships that enrich the lives of all involved. As the sun set over the preserve on another peaceful day, Sentinel perched on its favorite tree, watching over the lion family with the same devotion it had shown since that first day in the Kalahari Desert. Below, Kasai played with her cubs while Django rested in the shade, his massive form relaxed and content. The impossible had indeed happened, and in doing so, it had revealed new truths about the depth and complexity of the natural world. The eagle that had chosen to raise 2 lion cubs had created something beautiful and lasting, a testament to the power of love to overcome the boundaries that seemed to separate us all. In the gathering twilight, their story continued, a living reminder that sometimes the most extraordinary relationships are born from the most unexpected circumstances, and that the heart recognizes no limits when it comes to protecting those we love.